The horses screamed and lunged forward, sending the carriage careening down the mountainside at a speed that meant death. And Penelope Northfield knew in that crystalline instant that all her breeding, all her education, all her carefully cultivated superiority meant absolutely nothing when faced with 2,000 pounds of panicked horseflesh dragging her toward oblivion. But that moment of clarity came later, after the morning had begun with such tedious predictability at Mrs. Harrison Blackwell's garden party in the fashionable Capitol Hill neighborhood of Denver, where the wives and daughters of mining magnates gathered to pretend they were still in Boston or Philadelphia, transplanting their Eastern sensibilities onto Colorado soil like hothouse flowers that required constant tending. Penelope had arrived in Denver 3 weeks earlier, sent by her father to visit her maternal aunt and uncle, ostensibly to broaden her horizons but really to escape the whispers that had followed her broken engagement to a senator's son, whose wandering eye had finally wandered too far. At 23, Penelope was considered dangerously close to being on the shelf, though her beauty, her impeccable manners, and her family's considerable fortune kept the marriage prospects circling like well-dressed vultures. She wore a gown of pale blue silk that had cost more than most Denver families earned in 6 months, and her dark hair was arranged in the latest Eastern fashion, swept up and pinned with combs of tortoiseshell and pearl. The garden party itself was a display of wealth and refinement, with tables draped in Irish linen, crystal glasses catching the August sunlight, and servants moving silently between the guests with trays of delicate pastries and iced champagne. Penelope stood in a cluster of women her age, all of them daughters of the newly rich, discussing the upcoming season's social calendar with the kind of earnest intensity usually reserved for matters of actual importance. It was during this conversation that Mrs. Blackwell announced her plan for the following day's excursion into the mountains, a picnic at a scenic overlook that would showcase Colorado's natural grandeur to her eastern visitors. "Of course, we will need appropriate escorts for the journey," Mrs. Blackwell said, her voice carrying the slight nasal quality of old New York money. "The mountain roads can be treacherous, and I have engaged the services of several capable men to ensure our safety and comfort." "How thrilling," murmured one of the other young ladies, a blonde girl named Catherine whose father owned half the silver mines in Leadville. "Will they be proper gentlemen, or will we be subjected to those rough Western types?" Mrs. Blackwell laughed, a tinkling sound that suggested the question itself was charming in its naivety. "My dear, in Colorado, one must sometimes compromise. I have hired Xavier Norwood, who owns a considerable cattle ranch in the valley and is considered quite respectable by local standards. He will oversee our security and manage the practical arrangements." The name meant nothing to Penelope, but the description sent a small shudder of distaste through her carefully maintained composure. A cattle rancher. A man who spent his days covered in dust and worse, whose hands would be rough from labor, whose conversation would likely consist of grunts and observations about the weather. She had not traveled 1,500 miles to be herded about by some provincial cowboy who probably could not tell Wordsworth from a watering hole. "I confess I have little enthusiasm for being escorted by a cowboy," Penelope said, her voice cool and precise. "Surely there are civilized alternatives, men of actual education and refinement who could serve the purpose without subjecting us to rustic discomfort." Mrs. Blackwell's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Norwood comes highly recommended. He is quite reliable, I am told, and knows these mountains better than anyone." "Reliability is a fine quality in a horse," Penelope replied, aware that she was being rude but unable to stop herself. The frustration of her exile, the humiliation of her failed engagement, the suffocating expectations of her class, all of it bubbled up in this small act of rebellion. I simply do not see why we must lower our standards simply because we find ourselves in less refined surroundings. A cowboy is a cowboy, regardless of how many cattle he owns or how well he cleans up for polite company. The other women exchanged glances, some scandalized, others secretly pleased by Penelope's boldness. Mrs. Blackwell looked as though she had bitten into a lemon pastry, but she recovered quickly, changing the subject with practiced ease. The moment passed, absorbed into the general flow of gossip and small talk, and Penelope thought nothing more of it until the following morning, when she stood on the front steps of her aunt's mansion and watched a line of 3 carriages pull up, each drawn by a pair of perfectly matched horses, their coats gleaming in the early light. The man who climbed down from the lead carriage was not what Penelope had expected, though she would have died before admitting it. Xavier Norwood stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and a frame that spoke of physical labor and hard living. He wore dark trousers, a vest over a crisp white shirt, and a hat with a wide brim that shaded his face. His boots were clean but worn, practical rather than decorative, and at his hip he wore a revolver in a leather holster that looked as natural as a pocket watch on a banker. He was probably 30, give or take a year, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that touched his collar. His face was all angles and planes, handsome in a stark, uncompromising way that had nothing to do with the soft prettiness of the Eastern men Penelope knew. He moved with an economy of motion that suggested every gesture had a purpose, checking the harnesses on each carriage, speaking in low tones to the drivers, his eyes constantly scanning the street as though assessing invisible threats. When Mrs. Blackwell emerged from her own home and called his name, he touched his hat brim and approached, listening to her instructions with an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. He said almost nothing in return, just nodded occasionally, his gaze flicking briefly to the assembled ladies before returning to Mrs. Blackwell's face. Penelope found herself irritated by his silence, by the way he seemed to exist in his own sphere, untouched by the social niceties that governed every interaction in her world. When Mrs. Blackwell introduced him to the group, he acknowledged each woman with a slight nod and a murmured greeting that barely qualified as speech. When he reached Penelope, his eyes met hers for perhaps 2 seconds, long enough for her to register that they were a startling shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds over the prairie, and then he moved on without comment. "He is rather taciturn," one of the other women whispered as they settled into the carriages. Penelope found herself assigned to the second carriage with Catherine and 2 other young ladies, while Mrs. Blackwell and the older matrons took the first. The third carriage carried servants and the elaborate picnic that had been prepared for the outing. The journey began pleasantly enough, the carriages rolling through Denver's streets and then climbing into the foothills, where pine trees replaced buildings and the air grew thinner and sweeter. Xavier rode alongside on a large bay horse, sometimes leading the small procession, sometimes falling back to check on the rear carriage, but always visible, always watchful. He spoke occasionally to the drivers, pointing out hazards in the road or suggesting they slow for a particularly steep section, but he never addressed the passengers directly. Penelope tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the conversation inside the carriage, which ranged from fashion to local gossip to speculation about which gentleman would attend the harvest ball in September. But she found her attention wandering, drawn to the landscape unfolding outside the window. Colorado was nothing like Philadelphia, where everything was ordered and civilized, built up and tamed. Here, the mountains rose like ancient giants, their peaks still capped with snow even in August, and the valleys spread out in sweeping vistas of green and gold that seemed to go on forever. The sky was a blue so deep it hurt to look at, unmarred by the smoke and haze of eastern cities, and the silence between human voices was filled with the sound of wind in the pines and the distant cry of hawks. They stopped once at a small creek, where the horses were watered, and the ladies were permitted to stretch their legs and partake of cool lemonade that had been packed in ice. Xavier dismounted and checked each horse carefully, running his hands down their legs, examining their hooves, adjusting straps and buckles with the focused attention of a surgeon. Penelope watched him despite herself, fascinated by the quiet competence in every movement. He worked without hurry but without wasted motion, and when one of the carriage horses showed signs of favoring its left foreleg, he spent several minutes examining the hoof, eventually removing a small stone that had become lodged there. "Is it safe to continue, Mrs.?" Blackwell asked, hovering nearby with concern creasing her forehead. "Yes, madam," Xavier said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Just a stone. He will be fine. You are quite skilled with horses, Mr. Norwood." "Spent most of my life with them, madam." That was apparently the extent of his conversation, because he turned back to his work without elaborating, leaving Mrs. Blackwell to retreat with a slightly bewildered expression. Penelope felt a small flutter of something she refused to identify as interest. She told herself it was merely curiosity, the same kind of detached observation one might apply to studying an exotic animal at a menagerie. The picnic site was everything Mrs. Blackwell had promised, a broad meadow at the edge of a cliff that overlooked a valley so vast it seemed to contain entire worlds. The servants set up tables and chairs, unpacked baskets of cold chicken and ham, fresh bread, cheese, fruit, and an array of desserts that would have done credit to the finest Philadelphia restaurant. The ladies exclaimed over the view, posed for photographs with a camera that one of the husbands had brought, and generally behaved as though they were still in someone's carefully landscaped garden rather than perched on the edge of wilderness. Xavier remained apart from the festivities, sitting on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing with his horse's reins looped loosely in one hand. He ate something from a cloth bag, probably jerky or dried beef, and drank from a canteen, his gaze constantly moving across the landscape. Penelope found herself annoyed by his separateness, by the way he seemed to judge them all and find them wanting without saying a single word. She walked over to him with her chin lifted, her silk skirts swishing against the grass. "Mr. Norwood." He stood immediately, removing his hat in a gesture that was automatic rather than deferential. "Madam, do you disapprove of our gathering?" The question came out sharper than she intended. His expression did not change. "No, madam. You sit apart as though we carry some contagious disease." "Just doing my job, madam. Keeping watch. For what? Bandits? Wild animals? Or do you simply find our company tedious?" Something flickered in those gray-blue eyes, gone too quickly to interpret. "The mountains do not care about anybody's social standing, Miss Northfield. Things can go wrong fast out here. I prefer to see them coming." He knew her name. The realization sent an odd little jolt through her. "And you think we are too foolish to understand that? I think you are enjoying a picnic, which is what you came here to do. No harm in that. But you find us ridiculous." She was pushing now, looking for a reaction, something to justify her initial disdain. He settled his hat back on his head, a gesture that felt like dismissal. "I think you are young ladies having a good time. Nothing wrong with that either." Before she could respond, Catherine called her name, waving from the picnic area, and Penelope had no choice but to return, feeling oddly deflated by the encounter. Xavier sat back down and returned to his silent vigil, and Penelope tried to forget about him as she rejoined the party. The afternoon stretched long and golden, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the western peaks. Mrs. Blackwell finally declared it time to return to Denver, and the servants began packing up the remnants of the picnic, while the ladies gathered their things and prepared to reboard the carriages. The mood was relaxed, everyone slightly drowsy from food and fresh air, and nobody noticed when the carriage horses started shifting restlessly in their traces, ears flicking forward and back, eyes rolling white at the edges. Nobody except Xavier, who was suddenly on his feet, his entire body alert. He moved toward the horses with quick strides, speaking in low, soothing tones, but before he could reach them, something crashed through the underbrush at the edge of the meadow. A massive black bear, probably startled from its afternoon foraging by the noise of the party, burst into the clearing with a roar that sent every person present into frozen shock. The horses exploded into panic. The lead carriage team reared and plunged, snapping the brake lever like kindling, and then they were running, the carriage bouncing wildly behind them as it careened toward the road. Mrs. Blackwell and the two other matrons inside screamed, their faces white masks of terror visible through the windows. The second team, where Penelope and her companions were already settling into their seats, followed an instant later, the horses feeding off each other's fear, their hooves pounding the earth in a thunder that drowned out every other sound. Penelope felt the carriage lurch forward, slamming her back against the seat. Catherine screamed. The other two girls clutched at each other, their carefully arranged hair already coming loose, their hats flying off as the carriage picked up speed. Through the window, Penelope saw Xavier running for his horse, saw him vault into the saddle with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for a man his size, and then he was galloping after them, his hat gone, his face set in lines of absolute concentration. The road down the mountain was a series of switchbacks, each turn sharp enough to threaten disaster. The carriage tilted sickeningly as they rounded the first curve, two wheels lifting off the ground before crashing back down with a jolt that rattled Penelope's teeth. The horses had the bit in their mouths now, beyond responding to the driver's desperate attempts to slow them, and the driver himself was fighting just to stay in his seat, his hands wrapped so tightly around the reins that Penelope could see his white knuckles from inside the carriage. They were going to die. The thought arrived with perfect clarity, absent of panic, just a simple statement of fact. The next turn would be too sharp, or the one after that, and the carriage would tumble over the edge, and they would all be broken on the rocks below. Penelope thought of her mother, who had died when Penelope was 15, and wondered if she would see her again in whatever came next. She thought of her father, who loved her in his distant, formal way, and hoped he would not blame himself. She thought of all the things she had never done, all the experiences she had dismissed as beneath her or too common or simply unnecessary, and she felt a piercing regret that tasted like ashes. Then Xavier was beside the carriage, his horse running flat out, foam flying from its mouth, its hooves striking sparks from the rocky ground. He was leaning forward in the saddle, urging the animal to greater speed, and slowly, impossibly, he began to pull ahead. Penelope watched through the window as he drew even with the panicked team, then edged forward until he was alongside the lead horse, a big black gelding with wild eyes and flared nostrils. What happened next took perhaps 10 seconds, but unfolded with the slow-motion clarity of a dream. Xavier stood in his stirrups, balanced on his toes like an acrobat, and then he launched himself from his own saddle onto the back of the carriage horse. He hit hard enough that Penelope heard the impact even over the thunder of hooves and the screaming of the women inside, but he held on, his legs clamping around the horse's barrel, his hands reaching for the bridle. The horse bucked and twisted, trying to dislodge this new terror, but Xavier held firm, his mouth near the animal's ear, his voice a steady stream of sound that Penelope could not hear but could somehow sense, a calm presence in the chaos. Gradually, impossibly, the horses began to slow. It took another full minute, the carriage still careening down the mountain, but the headlong gallop became a canter, then a rough trot, and finally, blessedly, they stopped, the horses blowing and trembling, their sides heaving like bellows. Penelope found herself shaking so hard she could barely remain upright, her hands gripped around the window frame, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Xavier slid off the carriage horse and spent several minutes with the team, his hands moving over them, his voice still low and steady. By the time the other carriages caught up, followed by several men who had ridden from the picnic site after the bear had been driven off, the immediate crisis had passed. The driver climbed down on legs that barely held him, tears streaming down his face, and Xavier caught him before he could collapse, easing him to the ground with surprising gentleness. Mrs. Blackwell's carriage had been stopped by its driver, who had managed to regain control before disaster struck, and she emerged shaken but unhurt. The third carriage had never bolted, its more placid horses having been far enough from the bear to avoid the worst of the panic. But it was Penelope's carriage that had been in the greatest danger, careening down that treacherous road with death waiting at every turn. Xavier opened the carriage door and stood back, offering his hand to help the passengers out. Catherine stumbled out first, sobbing, followed by the other two girls, both white-faced and trembling. Penelope emerged last, her legs unsteady, her carefully arranged composure in tatters. When Xavier's hand closed around hers, rough and warm and solid, she felt something shift inside her chest, some fundamental recalibration of the world and her place in it. "You are safe now," he said, and released her hand, already turning to check on the others. "You saved our lives." The words came out barely above a whisper. He glanced back at her, and for just a moment his expression softened into something almost like concern. "Doing my job, madam." "That was not your job, that was." She could not find the words, could not explain what she had just witnessed. "Thank you." He nodded once and moved away, and Penelope stood there in the mountain road with her heart hammering and her hands still shaking, watching him work with the same quiet efficiency he had displayed all day, as though risking his life to save a group of strangers was simply part of the expected routine. The return to Denver was subdued, the earlier festive mood replaced by the kind of quiet that follows near disaster. Xavier insisted on personally driving Penelope's carriage, with one of the other men taking his horse. He kept the pace slow and steady, checking the horses frequently, and by the time they reached the city, full darkness had fallen and gaslights glowed in windows up and down the elegant streets. When the carriage stopped in front of her aunt's house, Penelope's uncle emerged, having been alerted by an advance rider about the incident. He was a portly man with impressive side whiskers and the slightly flustered manner of someone unused to drama, and he fussed over Penelope with genuine concern, ushering her inside while her aunt called for hot tea and blankets and every other remedy she could think of for shock. Penelope paused at the door and looked back. Xavier was still with the carriage, checking the horses one final time, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. She wanted to say something, to find words adequate to what had happened, but nothing seemed sufficient. He touched his hat brim when he caught her looking, a gesture of farewell, and then he was climbing back into the driver's seat, turning the horses toward whatever destination awaited him. That night, Penelope lay awake in her comfortable bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events over and over. She saw again that moment when Xavier had leaped from his horse to the runaway team, risking everything without hesitation. She saw the strength in his hands and the calm in his eyes and the absolute focus that had allowed him to do the impossible. And she saw, with uncomfortable clarity, her own foolishness, her casual dismissal of a man about whom she had known nothing except the prejudices of her own narrow world. In the morning, she came downstairs to find her aunt and uncle at breakfast, discussing the previous day's adventure with the kind of relieved animation that follows a danger safely passed. Her uncle was reading the newspaper, which contained a brief account of the incident, describing Xavier as a local rancher whose quick thinking and exceptional horsemanship prevented what could have been a tragedy. "I should like to thank Mr. Norwood properly," Penelope said, surprising herself with the words. Her aunt looked up from her toast. "I am sure a letter would be appropriate, dear. I can have one of the servants deliver it to his ranch. I would prefer to thank him in person." Her aunt and uncle exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that came from decades of marriage. "That would be rather irregular," her uncle said carefully. "A young lady calling upon a bachelor at his home." "He saved my life," Penelope said, hearing the steel in her own voice. Surely that supersedes normal social conventions. In the end, a compromise was reached. Her uncle would arrange for Xavier to come to dinner at their home, a properly chaperoned occasion where Penelope could express her gratitude without causing scandal. The invitation was sent that afternoon, and the response came back the following day. Mr. Norwood would be honored to accept. The intervening days passed with strange slowness. Penelope found herself restless, unable to settle into the usual round of social calls and afternoon teas that filled her aunt's calendar. She took long walks in the neighborhood, staring at the mountains that ringed the city, thinking about what lay beyond them. She had been in Denver for nearly a month, and had seen almost nothing of the real West, just this carefully constructed facsimile of Eastern society that the wealthy had built to insulate themselves from their surroundings. When the evening of the dinner finally arrived, Penelope spent an absurd amount of time choosing her dress, finally settling on a gown of deep green silk that brought out the color of her eyes. Her aunt supervised while the maid arranged Penelope's hair in an elaborate style that seemed suddenly ridiculous. All these curls and pins and affectations designed to advertise refinement and status. Xavier arrived precisely on time, dressed in a dark suit that fit him well enough but clearly saw limited use. He had shaved and tamed his hair, and without the trail dust and the ever-present hat, he looked younger, though no less serious. He brought flowers for her aunt, a simple gesture that nevertheless seemed to please her, and he greeted Penelope's uncle with a firm handshake and direct eye contact. Dinner was a peculiar affair, with Penelope's aunt working hard to maintain conversation in the face of Xavier's monosyllabic responses. He answered questions politely, but volunteered nothing, and Penelope could see her aunt growing increasingly flustered, unsure how to draw out this taciturn guest. Her uncle, more accustomed to dealing with men of few words in his business dealings, seemed less bothered, asking straightforward questions about Xavier's ranch and the cattle business, receiving brief but informative replies. Penelope found herself studying him throughout the meal, noticing details she had missed before. The way his hands, rough and scarred from work, handled the delicate china and crystal with unexpected care. The way his eyes moved around the room, taking in everything, that same watchful quality she had observed in the mountains. The way he listened when people spoke, really listened, his attention focused entirely on the speaker even when he had little to say in response. After dinner, her uncle excused himself to his study, pleading business correspondence, and her aunt, with a meaningful look at Penelope, announced that she needed to speak with the cook about the following day's menu. This transparent chaperoning strategy left Penelope alone with Xavier in the parlor, though her aunt remained visible through the doorway, busying herself with imaginary tasks. "I wanted to thank you properly," Penelope said, standing near the fireplace where the gas flames flickered behind ornate screens. "What you did, Mr. Norwood, was extraordinary. Just glad everyone made it back safe." He remained standing as well, too large and too real for the delicate furniture that filled the room. "You could have been killed. You must know that. What you did was incredibly dangerous." He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he might simply shrug off the comment, but then he said, "Could not just let the carriage go over the edge. Most men would have. Most men would have watched and been horrified, but they would not have risked themselves." "Then most men are not worth much." He said it simply, without judgment, just a statement of fact. "I owe you my life." "You do not owe me anything, Miss Northfield." He looked directly at her then, those gray-blue eyes steady and serious. "You made it clear you did not want a cowboy's company." "I understand that. I do not expect gratitude or anything else from you. I did what needed doing, and that is the end of it." The words hit her like a slap, made worse, because they were delivered without malice or bitterness, just a calm acknowledgment of the social gulf between them. Penelope felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassment and shame warring for dominance. "I was insufferably rude," she said quietly. "I judged you without knowing anything about you. I dismissed you because you did not fit my narrow definition of acceptable society. And then you saved my life, and I realized how small and foolish I have been." He looked uncomfortable now, shifting his weight. "You do not need to apologize for speaking your mind, madam. But I do. Because I was wrong, Mr. Norwood, completely, utterly wrong. You are worth 10 of the so-called gentlemen I grew up around, with all their fine manners and empty words. You are real, and what you did was real. And I have been living in a world of performance and pretense for so long that I forgot what substance looks like." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sounds of the household. Xavier's expression had gone carefully neutral, the walls he kept around himself visibly in place. "I should be going," he said finally. "I have an early start tomorrow." "Will you call again?" The question escaped before Penelope could stop it. Too eager, too revealing, he hesitated, and she saw the refusal forming, saw him drawing back into his solitary world. "I do not think that would be appropriate, Miss Northfield. You are going back east soon, I expect." "No point in complicating things. What if I do not want to go back east?" That stopped him. His eyes searched her face, looking for something, though she could not guess what. "You do not belong here." "How do you know where I belong?" "I know your world and mine do not mix." "Oil and water, Miss Northfield. Better to leave it at that." He was protecting himself, she realized. Protecting himself from rejection, from the impossibility of their circumstances, from wanting something he believed he could never have. The understanding came with perfect clarity, along with another realization that made her breath catch. Somewhere between the garden party and this moment, this quiet, stoic man had developed feelings for her, and he was doing everything in his power to contain them. "And if I said I wanted them to mix?" She took a step toward him, emboldened by the knowledge. "What then?" His jaw tightened. "Then I would say you are caught up in the drama of what happened, feeling grateful and mistaking it for something else. Give it time. You will go back to your life, and I will go back to mine, and this will all fade into a story you tell at dinner parties. You do not know me well enough to make those assumptions. Maybe not, but I know enough to recognize when something is impossible. He moved toward the door, clearly ready to end the conversation. Thank you for the dinner, Miss Northfield. I wish you well. He was gone before she could respond, leaving her standing in the parlor with her heart pounding and her mind racing. Her aunt appeared in the doorway, her expression concerned. Did something happen, dear? He left rather abruptly. He is afraid, Penelope said, more to herself than to her aunt. Afraid, Mr. Norwood, he hardly seems the type. Not of bears or runaway carriages, of this. She gestured vaguely at the room, the house, the world they inhabited. Of me. Her aunt moved closer, settling onto one of the delicate chairs. Penelope, you must understand, a man like Mr. Norwood lives a very different life than what you are accustomed to. The ranch is hard work, dawn to dusk, in all weather. It is not garden parties and theater and the kind of society you grew up with. I know that. Do you? Or are you romanticizing him because he rescued you? These things can feel very powerful in the moment, but when the emotion fades, you are left with the reality of incompatible lives. What if the emotion does not fade? What if it grows stronger the more I think about it? Her aunt sighed. Then I would say you are on a dangerous path, my dear. Your father sent you here to recover from one broken engagement. I do not think he would appreciate you forming an attachment to a cattle rancher, no matter how heroic. But Penelope was barely listening. Her mind had already moved past objections and obstacles, focusing instead on the essential question. What did she actually want? Not what her father wanted, or what society expected, or what her carefully cultivated breeding dictated, but what she, Penelope Northfield, truly desired for her life. The answer surprised her with its clarity. She wanted to feel real again. She wanted to strip away the layers of performance and pretense, and find out who she actually was beneath all that training. She wanted to know what it felt like to be with someone who said what he meant and did what he said, who risked everything without hesitation when it mattered. She wanted Xavier Norwood, this hard, quiet man who built walls around himself and probably had no idea how to let anyone inside. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like liberation. The next morning, Penelope announced to her startled aunt and uncle that she wished to extend her stay in Denver indefinitely. Her uncle pointed out that her father expected her back in Philadelphia by the end of September. Her aunt suggested that perhaps Penelope needed more time to think about such a decision. Penelope listened politely, and then wrote to her father, explaining that she had found Colorado agreeable and wished to remain through the autumn, possibly longer. She did not mention Xavier, knowing that would only generate opposition. Instead, she cited the climate, the social opportunities, and her growing attachment to her aunt and uncle. Her father's response, when it came 2 weeks later, was predictably disapproving but ultimately acquiescent. He was busy with his own affairs, and seemed relieved not to have to manage Penelope's social rehabilitation personally. He gave her permission to remain until Christmas, at which point he expected her home to prepare for the spring season. With that settled, Penelope set about the considerably more difficult task of seeing Xavier again. He had made himself scarce, declining invitations to social events where he might have encountered her, and his ranch was far enough from the city to make casual visits impossible. She could have sent a letter, but that felt cowardly, an inadequate medium for what she needed to say. Instead, she enlisted the help of Mrs. Blackwell, who owed her a considerable debt of gratitude after the rescue. "I need you to arrange another outing," Penelope said over tea in Mrs. Blackwell's drawing room, something that would require Mr. Norwood's services as guide and escort. Mrs. Blackwell's eyebrows rose. "My dear, are you certain that is wise? After what happened on the last excursion, I am not sure I can convince anyone to venture into the mountains again." Then somewhere else. A visit to his ranch, perhaps, to see genuine Colorado ranching. You are always saying how important it is to understand the local culture. What better way than to observe it firsthand? Understanding dawned in Mrs. Blackwell's eyes, followed by concern. "Penelope, I do not think I should facilitate what appears to be a romantic pursuit. Your aunt would never forgive me, and your father would be apoplectic." "My aunt and father are not here, and I am not asking you to facilitate anything improper. Just arrange for a group visit to Mr. Norwood's ranch. I will handle the rest." In the end, Mrs. Blackwell agreed, perhaps sensing that Penelope would find a way regardless of whether she helped or not. A week later, Penelope found herself in a carriage with 5 other ladies and 2 gentlemen chaperones, traveling west from Denver into the broader valley, where Xavier's ranch spread across several thousand acres. The landscape changed as they moved away from the city, the carefully groomed neighborhoods giving way to open grassland, dotted with cattle and horses. The mountains remained a constant presence, rising to the west in serried ranks of blue and purple, their peaks dusted with the first snows of autumn. The air had a different quality out here, sharper and cleaner, carrying scents of sage and grass and distance. Xavier's ranch house came into view as they crested a low rise, a substantial building of logs and stone with a wide porch that faced the mountains. Outbuildings scattered around it, barns and corrals and storage sheds, all well maintained and functional. Horses grazed in a nearby pasture, and in the distance, Penelope could see cattle spread across the grassland like dark, moving clouds. Xavier emerged from the house as the carriages approached, and Penelope felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. He wore his working clothes, denim trousers and a chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and he moved with that same quiet economy she remembered. His expression when he saw the visitors was carefully polite, revealing nothing, but she thought she detected a flicker of something in his eyes when his gaze found her. He was a gracious host, showing them around the ranch with brief but informative commentary, answering questions with his usual brevity. He introduced them to his foreman, a grizzled man named Samuel who had clearly worked cattle all his life, and several of the ranch hands, young men who regarded the visitors with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. The ladies exclaimed over the horses and kept a cautious distance from the cattle, and the gentlemen asked questions about the economics of ranching that Xavier answered with more detail than he had offered for anything else. Penelope watched him throughout, noticing how he was different here, on his own land. Not more talkative, but more present somehow, as though the ranch was an extension of himself in a way that nothing in the city could be. He showed them the stable where he kept his breeding stock, horses of exceptional quality that he raised and trained himself. He explained the seasonal rhythms of ranch work, the spring calving and branding, the summer grazing, the autumn roundup, and the long, hard winters when the ranch battened down and simply endured. Lunch was served on the porch, a simple meal of beef and beans and fresh bread that had been prepared by Xavier's cook, a Mexican woman named Rosa who ruled the kitchen with benevolent efficiency. The food was nothing like the elaborate meals Penelope was accustomed to, but it tasted real in a way that hotel dining and formal dinners did not, flavored with honest work and open air. After lunch, as the others explored the immediate grounds, Penelope found herself alone with Xavier near the corral, watching a young horse that he was training. The animal was skittish, dancing away from Xavier's approach, but he moved with infinite patience, his voice low and steady, until the horse finally stood still and allowed him to stroke its neck. "He trusts you," Penelope said, getting there. "Trust takes time. Is that true for everything? Or just horses?" He glanced at her, and she saw a hint of amusement in his expression. "Most things worth having take time, Miss Northfield. I extended my stay in Denver. I will be here through Christmas." His hand stilled on the horse's neck. "That is a long time. I find I am not ready to return east. There are things here that interest me. Such as the landscape, the openness, the way people here seem less concerned with appearances and more focused on substance." She paused. "You." The word hung between them, stark and honest. Xavier's expression closed down, those walls going up again. "Miss Northfield, I thought we settled this." "You settled it. I never agreed. You are going to make this difficult, are you not?" "Probably. I have a tendency to be stubborn when I want something." He turned to face her fully, his gray-blue eyes searching hers. "And what is it you think you want?" "To know you. To understand what made you the man who would risk everything for strangers. To see if this feeling I have, this sense that everything in my life before was just preparation for something real, is true or just imagination. And if it is just imagination, then I will have spent some time in beautiful country with interesting people, and I will go home no worse for the experience. But if it is not, if this is real, then walking away without finding out would be the greatest mistake of my life." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze never leaving her face. Then, so softly she almost missed it, he said, "You scare me." "Why?" "Because you make me want things I gave up wanting a long time ago, things I decided were not for men like me." "What things?" "A life that is more than just work and sleep and getting through another season, someone to share it with, someone who—" He stopped, shook his head. "This is a bad idea. The best things usually are." She moved closer, close enough to smell the scent of horses and leather and sun-warmed cotton that clung to him. "I am not asking for promises or commitments, Xavier. I am just asking for a chance. Let me visit again. Let us talk, get to know each other, see where it goes." "Your father will never accept me. My father does not have to live my life. Society will never accept us. Then perhaps I need a different society." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture so unexpected and tender that she felt tears prick her eyes. "You do not know what you are asking for. This life is hard, Penelope. The winters are brutal, the work never ends, and there is not much room for the kind of elegance and refinement you grew up with. And you do not know how tired I am of elegance and refinement. How exhausted I am from performing all the time, playing the perfect daughter, the perfect society lady, never saying what I really think or doing what I really want. I am 23 years old, and I feel like I have been living someone else's life." His hand lingered near her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone in a touch so light it was barely there. Then he dropped his arm and stepped back, breaking the moment. "I am not going to make this easy for you. I do not want easy, I want real. Then come back next week. I will teach you to ride, really ride, not that side saddle nonsense you city ladies do. If you want to know this life, you need to know horses." It was not a declaration of love, not even really an agreement to court her properly. But it was an opening, a crack in those walls he had built so carefully, and Penelope seized it with both hands. "Next week, I will be here." The riding lessons became the fixed point around which the next 6 weeks revolved. Penelope came to the ranch every week, sometimes alone with a chaperone in the form of her aunt's reluctant maid, sometimes with 1 or 2 other ladies from Mrs. Blackwell's circle who claimed an interest in learning proper Western riding. Xavier was patient but demanding, teaching her the basics with a seriousness that suggested he wanted her to truly understand, not just dabble. She learned to sit astride rather than side-saddle, scandalizing her aunt, but earning Xavier's approving nod. She learned to read a horse's mood from the set of its ears and the tension in its body. She learned to communicate with her knees and weight and gentle pressure rather than hauling on the reins. She fell off more times than she could count in those first weeks, hitting the ground hard enough to bruise, but Xavier was always there to help her up, his hands steadying her, his voice calm and reassuring. "Again," he would say, and she would climb back into the saddle, determined to master this skill that came so naturally to him. Between lessons, they talked. Or rather, Penelope talked and Xavier listened, occasionally offering a comment or observation that revealed depths she had not expected. She told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, the pressure to conform, the endless social obligations, the sense that she was being groomed for a specific role rather than encouraged to discover who she actually was. She told him about her broken engagement, the humiliation of discovering her fiancé with another woman, the way society had whispered and judged while maintaining a veneer of sympathy. Xavier shared less, but what he did reveal was carefully chosen and honest. He had grown up on a small farm in Missouri, the youngest of 4 brothers. His parents had died when he was 17, cholera taking them within days of each other, and he had come west with nothing but his horse and his father's rifle. He had worked as a ranch hand for years, saving every penny, learning everything he could about cattle and horses and land. When he was 25, he had bought his first 100 acres and a dozen head of cattle. Now, 5 years later, he owned 5,000 acres and ran over 1,000 head, building something that would last, something that was entirely his own. "You ever get lonely?" Penelope asked one afternoon as they sat on the porch, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and rose. "Used to. Got accustomed to it after a while. That is not the same as not being lonely." He smiled, a rare expression that transformed his face. "No, it is not. Do I make it worse, being here knowing I will leave eventually?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Yes, but I would rather have this, even knowing how it will end, than never have known you at all." The words struck her with their simple honesty, with the vulnerability they revealed. She reached out and took his hand, their fingers intertwining, and they sat like that as the sun set and the first stars appeared, neither of them willing to break the moment. By November, Penelope knew she was in love with him. Not the shallow, performative love she had thought she felt for her fiancé, but something deeper and more essential, rooted in respect and admiration and genuine affection. She loved his quietness, the way his silence felt companionable rather than awkward. She loved his competence, the way he approached every task with focused attention. She loved the rare moments when his defenses came down, and he let her see the man beneath the stoicism, the tenderness and humor and deep capacity for feeling that he kept so carefully guarded. She loved who she was becoming around him, this version of herself that was braver and more honest, less concerned with appearances and more focused on substance. She learned to appreciate the ranch work, the satisfaction of physical labor, the connection to the land and animals that gave shape to every day. She learned to find beauty in simplicity, in a well-cooked meal after a long day, in the sight of horses running free across open grassland, in the sharp, clean air of a Colorado morning. Her transformation did not go unnoticed. Her aunt expressed increasing concern, worrying that Penelope was throwing away her future for a romantic fantasy. Her uncle was more pragmatic, noting that Xavier was a man of substance and property, hardly a disreputable match, though certainly not what Penelope's father would have chosen. Letters from Philadelphia grew more insistent, her father demanding to know when she would return, hinting that he had prospects lined up for her, suitable men from appropriate families who could provide the life she deserved. Penelope ignored them all. She had made her choice, though she had not yet spoken it aloud to anyone, even Xavier. She was waiting for the right moment, for some sign that he was ready to hear it, that he believed she truly understood what she would be giving up and gaining. The moment came in mid-November, on a cold, bright day when the first real snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the ranch in white. Penelope had ridden out despite the weather, and she found Xavier in the stable, tending to a mare that was due to foal any day. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his face. "You should not have come out in this weather. I wanted to see you." She shook the snow from her coat and moved to stand beside him, looking down at the mare's swollen belly. "How is she?" "Restless." "Could be tonight, could be a few more days. Hard to tell." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the mare shift and resettle. Then Xavier said, without looking at her, "Your aunt called on me yesterday." Penelope's stomach dropped. "What did she want?" "To tell me that you are expected back in Philadelphia for Christmas. That your father has arranged several social engagements for you, introductions to eligible men. She said I should encourage you to go, that keeping you here was selfish and ultimately futile." "And what did you say?" "I said she was probably right, that you should go back to your life and stop wasting time on a cowboy who cannot give you what you deserve." Penelope felt anger flash through her, hot and sharp. "You had no right to make that decision for me. I have every right to be honest about what I can and cannot offer. And you think I do not know that by now? After months of coming here, learning this life, seeing exactly what it entails, you think I am so foolish that I do not understand what I would be choosing? I think you are in love with the idea of something different, and when the novelty wears off, you will realize what you gave up and resent me for it. Or I am actually in love with you, and you are too afraid to believe it." The words hung in the air between them, raw and undeniable. Xavier's jaw tightened, and she saw the struggle in his eyes, the war between hope and self-protection. "Penelope, I cannot give you ballrooms and society and the life you were raised for. I can give you early mornings and hard work and long winters. I can give you this ranch and everything I am building here, but it will never be elegant or easy or anything like what you grew up with. I do not want what I grew up with. I want this. I want you." She moved closer, her hands fisting in his shirt. "I am not afraid of hard work or long winters or early mornings. I am afraid of going back to Philadelphia and spending the rest of my life wondering what could have been if I had just been brave enough to choose differently. Your father will cut you off, probably. Society will shun you. Let them. You will lose everything you have known and gain everything I have ever wanted." She looked up at him, willing him to see the truth in her eyes. "I love you, Xavier Norwood. I love your quietness and your strength and the way you care for every living thing on this ranch. I love the man you are and the life you have built, and I want to share it if you will let me." His defenses crumbled then, all those carefully maintained walls coming down at once. He pulled her to him with a fierceness that surprised her, his arms tight around her, his face buried in her hair. She felt him shaking, felt the depth of emotion he had been holding back for so long, and she held him just as tightly, understanding that this was surrender for him, a leap of faith that terrified him as much as it exhilarated her. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I fell for you the first moment I saw you at that garden party, all dressed up and looking down your nose at everyone. Told myself I was 10 kinds of fool, that you would never look twice at someone like me. And then you kept coming back, and you kept trying, and I kept hoping and trying not to hope, and it has been the most wonderful and terrible thing I have ever experienced." She laughed, the sound catching in her throat. "So, is that a yes?" "That is a yes, if you are sure. If you really know what you are choosing." "I am choosing you. I am choosing this life. I am choosing to be the person I am when I am here, rather than the person I was supposed to be in Philadelphia." He kissed her then, gentle and tentative at first, then deeper as years of loneliness and longing poured into the embrace. Penelope felt herself melting into him, felt the rightness of it settle into her bones, and she knew with absolute certainty that this was where she was meant to be. They were married 3 weeks later, in a small ceremony at the ranch with her aunt and uncle in attendance, along with Xavier's foreman and a handful of hands who had become his closest friends. Mrs. Blackwell came as well, offering her blessing and a beautiful set of linens for their home. Penelope wore a simple dress of cream wool, practical and warm, with her hair loose down her back, because Xavier had once mentioned he liked it that way. Xavier wore his suit and looked uncomfortable in it, but the expression on his face when he saw her walking toward him was worth every sacrifice she had made to get here. Her father did not attend. He had sent a curt letter disowning her for throwing away her future on an unsuitable match, and while the words stung, they did not surprise her. She had known this would be the price, and she had chosen to pay it. Her aunt cried during the ceremony, though whether from joy or sorrow Penelope could not tell. Her uncle gave her away with gruff affection, squeezing her hand before placing it in Xavier's and whispering, "Be happy, girl. That is all that matters." The first months of marriage were an adjustment. The ranch house was comfortable but hardly luxurious, and Penelope learned to manage a household with just Rose's help and her own 2 hands. She learned to cook on the big iron stove, to preserve food for winter, to mend clothes and keep accounts and handle the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running. The work was endless, and there were days when she fell into bed exhausted, her hands raw and her back aching. But there were also moments of piercing joy. Waking next to Xavier in their bed, his arm heavy across her waist, watching the sunrise paint the mountains outside their window. Riding out across the ranch together, the horses moving in easy rhythm, the vast landscape spreading out in every direction. Sitting on the porch in the evenings, Xavier's hand in hers, talking about the day or not talking at all, just being together in the comfortable silence they had built. Xavier slowly opened up more, the walls around his heart coming down piece by piece. He told her about his dreams for the ranch, the improvements he wanted to make, the legacy he hoped to build. He showed her his vulnerable places, the fears he carried about failing, about losing everything he had worked for, about not being enough for her. She met each revelation with acceptance and reassurance, building trust brick by brick. Christmas came, and with it a package from Philadelphia. Penelope opened it to find a letter from her mother's sister, her father's sister-in-law, expressing regret for the estrangement and enclosing photographs of the family. There was also a smaller note, brief and stilted, from her father. It did not apologize, but it did acknowledge her marriage and wish her well, and Penelope chose to see it as the olive branch it was meant to be. Winter deepened, bringing snows that buried the ranch under feet of white. The work grew harder, feeding cattle in bitter cold, breaking ice on water troughs, keeping the stock alive through storms that lasted for days. But the ranch house stayed warm, with fires blazing in every hearth, and Penelope discovered that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, capable of enduring hardship she would once have thought impossible. In February, she realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with equal parts terror and joy, and when she told Xavier, he stared at her for a long moment before picking her up and spinning her around the kitchen, laughing with a freedom she had never heard from him before. He became even more protective, insisting she not overwork herself, though Penelope continued her ranch duties until her expanding belly made some tasks impossible. The baby, a daughter with Xavier's gray-blue eyes and Penelope's dark hair, was born in late September during the harvest season, with Rosa attending as midwife and Xavier pacing the porch until he was allowed inside to meet his child. They named her Vivienne, after Penelope's mother, and she became the center of their world, this small, perfect creature who had Xavier wrapped around her tiny finger from the moment he first held her. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were hard seasons when drought or disease threatened the herd, when money was tight and the future uncertain. There were moments when Penelope missed her old life, the ease and elegance of it, though those moments grew fewer and farther between as she sank deeper roots into this new existence. There were conflicts and misunderstandings, the inevitable friction of two strong people learning to build a life together. But there was also profound happiness, the kind that came from choosing each other every day, from building something real and lasting through shared effort and mutual respect. Penelope learned to be the woman she had always suspected she could be, strong and capable and deeply connected to the land and the life she had chosen. Xavier learned to lower his defenses, to accept love and give it freely, to believe that he deserved the happiness he had found. 5 years after their wedding, on a Christmas morning with snow falling softly outside, they gathered in the ranch house living room with Vivienne, now a bright, curious 4-year-old who had already declared her intention to be a rancher like her father. To Penelope's surprise and delight, her aunt and uncle had made the journey from Denver for the holiday, bringing with them an unexpected guest, her father. The reconciliation was awkward at first, years of hurt and stubbornness on both sides making conversation difficult. But Vivienne, with the unself-conscious charm of childhood, broke through the tension, climbing into her grandfather's lap and demanding stories of Philadelphia and what it was like where Mama used to live. Penelope's father, who had never been demonstrative with his own daughter, melted in the face of his granddaughter's affection. By the end of the visit, he had taken Xavier aside for a conversation that left her husband looking slightly stunned, but also pleased. Xavier would not tell her exactly what had been said, only that her father had apologized for his initial reaction, and acknowledged that Xavier had made Penelope happier than she would ever have been in Philadelphia society. That evening, after Vivienne had been tucked into bed and the guests had retired, Penelope and Xavier stood together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear winter sky. The mountains rose in silhouette against the last light of day, ancient and eternal, and Penelope felt the deep contentment that came from being exactly where she was meant to be. "You ever regret it?" Xavier asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Giving up your old life?" Penelope leaned into him, breathing in the familiar scent of him, feeling the solid strength of his presence. "Not once, not even for a moment. I still cannot believe you chose this, chose me." "I chose love," she said simply. "I chose the chance to be real rather than perfect. I chose the man who saw me at my worst moment and saved me, not just from a runaway carriage, but from a life that would have slowly suffocated everything true in me." He kissed the top of her head, a gesture that had become his signature expression of affection. "You saved me too. I was just too stubborn to admit I needed saving." They stood like that as the temperature dropped and the stars multiplied overhead, Two people who had found each other across impossible odds and built something lasting from the courage to be honest and the willingness to try. Inside, the house glowed with warmth and light, a home they had created together, filled with love and laughter and the promise of more joy to come. In the distance, a coyote called, its voice echoing across the snow-covered valley. The horses in the nearby pasture shifted and settled, secure in their corral. The cattle, bedded down for the night, rested peacefully. And in the ranch house, a little girl dreamed of horses and mountains and parents who loved her with a fierceness that would shape her entire life. This was the West that Penelope had chosen, raw and real and utterly unlike anything she had known before. It was hard work and long hours, early mornings and weather that could turn dangerous without warning. It was also beauty and freedom, space and possibility, a life built on honesty and effort rather than performance and pretense. And it was love, the kind that grew deeper with every passing season, rooted in respect and nurtured by shared experience. The kind that had started with a rescue and grown into partnership. The kind that had taught them both who they really were beneath the roles they had been expected to play. Penelope had once declared she did not want a cowboy, looking down from the heights of her social position at something she considered beneath her. But Xavier Norwood had proven to be so much more than the label she had dismissed so carelessly. He was strength and gentleness, courage and vulnerability, everything she had never known she needed until he had ridden into her life and changed it forever. And now, standing on the porch of their ranch house with the man she loved and the family they had built, Penelope understood that sometimes the things we think we do not want turn out to be exactly what we need. Sometimes the person who saves us is not the one we expect. And sometimes the greatest adventure of all is having the courage to choose a different path than the one that was laid out for us, to listen to our hearts instead of our training, and to build a life that is authentically, beautifully our own. The future stretched ahead of them, full of unknowns and challenges, but also full of promise. There would be more hard winters and difficult seasons, more obstacles to overcome and problems to solve. But they would face them together, this stoic cowboy and the high society lady who had fallen in love with him. Their bond forged in fire and tested by time and proven strong enough to last a lifetime. As Christmas morning dawned clear and cold over the Colorado mountains, the Norwood family woke to the smell of coffee and Rosa's cinnamon rolls, to the sound of Vivienne's excited squeals as she discovered the wooden horse Xavier had carved for her, to the sight of Penelope's father smiling despite himself as he watched his daughter's obvious happiness. They gathered around the table for breakfast, this collection of people who had learned to accept and love each other despite their differences, united by the bonds of family, and the understanding that love takes many forms and flourishes in unexpected places. Outside, the ranch spread out in all its winter glory, the land that had brought them together and would sustain them through all the years to come. And somewhere in that confluence of past and present, of choices made and lives transformed, Penelope caught Xavier's eye across the table and saw reflected there the same profound gratitude she felt. They had found each other against all odds, had chosen each other despite every obstacle, and had built something beautiful from the courage to be honest about who they were and what they wanted. It was not the life anyone would have predicted for either of them. But it was their life, earned through bravery and hard work, and the willingness to take a chance on something real. And as Xavier reached out under the table to squeeze her hand, as Vivienne chattered about horses and Christmas and everything wonderful in her world, as her father asked questions about the ranch with genuine interest, Penelope knew that she had made the right choice. She had not wanted a cowboy, once upon a time. Now she could not imagine wanting anything else. Because Xavier Norwood had shown her what it meant to truly live, to love without reservation, to build a life based on substance rather than appearance. He had rescued her from more than just a runaway carriage. He had rescued her from a future that would have been comfortable but empty, elegant but ultimately meaningless. And in choosing him, in choosing this wild, beautiful, challenging life, Penelope had rescued herself. She had found the courage to be who she really was, to claim the life she really wanted, and to love with all the passion and honesty she possessed. The high society lady and the stoic cowboy, unlikely partners who had become perfect matches. Their love story written in the sweeping landscape of the American West, and destined to endure as long as the mountains themselves stood watch over the valley they called home.